The transition from fossil fuel cars to electric vehicles has become the flagship of the fight against climate change. But how much emissions are EVs actually saving? The layman debate is wild, with answers ranging from EVs are actually more polluting than combustion engine cars to, well, it would save us from burning alive. I will calculate the emissions on both the individual car level and the global level from the ground up so you can follow the numbers. Before I go through the calculation, since the European Union is the most ambitious when it comes to electrification of cars, take a guess of what percentage of global emissions and EU emissions would be saved if all cars in the EU were switched to electric cars, and write your guess in the comment section. Let's dive into it. We first need to calculate how much CO2 are combustion engine cars producing. Europeans typically drive more fuel-efficient cars. The fuel economy of combustion engine cars has gone down to an average of slightly above 6 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers, with new cars achieving even 5. In USA, with more powerful and heavier cars and different driving habits, it's almost 9 liters per 100 kilometers. 1 liter of gasoline produces around 2.3 kilograms of CO2 and diesel almost 2.7 kilograms. Therefore, the average 100-kilometer drive in Europe produces around 15 or 16 kilograms of CO2. For new cars, it would be closer to 12. The efficiency of electric cars also differs, but I think an estimate of 5 kilometers or 3 miles per 1 kilowatt-hour should not anger anyone. This means that to drive 100 kilometers, the EV requires some 20 kilowatt-hours of electricity. Next, we need to calculate the emissions generated by electricity production. The best case scenario is 100% zero-emission electricity production, almost achieved by Norway and Sweden. In such case, the emissions would be basically zero. The worst case is 100% being produced in lignite power plants, basically Poland 20 years ago. Lignite power plants produce around 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt-hour, so in such case, the EV would produce 20 kilograms of CO2 per 100-kilometer drive, more than the gasoline car. Moreover, around 5 to 8% of electricity is lost during the transmission throughout the grid, so it's even slightly worse. Here is a graph to give you an idea about the pollution of EVs. It shows you the gasoline equivalent emissions of electric vehicles per 100 kilometers. For example, if the power plants emit on average 700 grams of CO2 per every kilowatt-hour generated, then the emissions from a 100-kilometer drive of an electric car are equivalent to 6.5 liters of gasoline. For our American viewers, here is the graph in miles per gallon. The assumptions are that the average EV needs 20 kilowatt-hours per 100 kilometers, and that 6% of electricity is lost during transmission. Now, the actual emission intensity of electricity production varies significantly state by state. Let's look at some European examples first. In Poland, with the dirtiest electricity in the EU, electric cars just about break even with combustion engine cars in terms of CO2 emissions. Germany, with its ill-advised nuclear phase-out, has still quite high emission intensity of around 360 grams per kilowatt-hour. Thus, running an EV in Germany produces around half the emissions of gasoline cars. On average in the EU, the electricity for EVs produces some 5 kilograms of CO2 emissions per 100-kilometer drive, or a third of the gasoline cars. But the European Union is a region with one of the cleanest electricity productions in the world. Let's look at the comparison with other regions. In China, which has one of the highest EV adoptions in the world, the electricity is so CO2 intensive that EVs have only marginally smaller emissions than regular cars. In India, don't even bother buying electric cars. With 20% grid transmission loss, the EVs would produce more emissions than gasoline cars. And you Aussies, electric car enthusiasts, you are not saving much emissions either. USA is also not the cleanest, with electricity emissions slightly higher than Germany. However, with less fuel-efficient cars, EVs would save up approximately 60% of emissions compared to combustion engines. South America, with a lot of hydropower, comes out the cleanest. So to answer the initial question, by how much would the European and global emissions be reduced if all cars in the EU suddenly became electric? The European share of emissions is some 8% of global emissions. Transportation makes up a quarter of those, and passenger cars 60% of that. Multiplying these numbers, the usage of cars in the EU make up 15% of annual European emissions and 1.2% of global emissions. Given the current average electricity mix in the EU, switching to electric cars would reduce the car emissions by 2/3, that is, 10% of European emissions and 0.8% of global emissions. What if all cars on the planet were replaced instead? Transportation represents around 20% of global emissions, out of which only some 45% are passenger cars, putting their share on global emissions to only 9%. The global average emissions from electricity are around 440 grams of CO2 per kilowatt-hour. Now, it is hard to average it out because cars are unevenly distributed around the globe. But given the current global electricity mix, EVs would on average produce almost 2/3 the amount of emissions of combustion engine cars, putting the global reduction of emissions to around 4% annually. In absolute amounts, that corresponds to 1.5 billion tons of CO2 per year. But remember, this was a calculation of only direct emissions of using the car or generating the necessary electricity. Replacing the 1.4 billion combustion engine cars in existence would be a gargantuan project. Just building that many EVs would emit some 12 to 20 billion tons of CO2, plus some emissions would come from building the necessary infrastructure and then from getting rid of the old batteries. This means that it would take around a decade for the EV's emission reduction just to repay the emissions coming from their manufacturing. Comment below if you would like me to do a video about the entire life cycle emissions. So while the direct usage of EVs is less polluting than of combustion engine cars in most countries, the difference is usually far from overwhelming, and the manufacturing process diminishes the reduction further. In some states with dirty electricity, the life cycle emissions of EVs are even worse than of comparable gasoline car. In light of these numbers, no one can hope that electric cars will help achieve some near-future emission goals, like for 2030 or 35. They may bear fruit in more distant future as the electricity gets cleaner and the manufacturing hopefully too. I hope that the calculation brings more clarity into the issue. I will see you in the next video.